Today, we are diving into one of the most amazing parts of pregnancy, your baby's movements. We're going to figure out what all those kicks, little flutters, and big rolls are actually trying to tell you.
So let's just start with a kind of wild thought. What if all those little bumps and wiggles you're feeling, what if they aren't just random? What if it's actually a conversation, a whole language that you can learn to understand?
Well, it turns out that's exactly what's happening. They absolutely are communicating with you. Every single kick, every flutter, every roll, it's a message. Movement is their very first language, and you're their very first conversation partner.
So where does this conversation start? Let's talk about those very first words, those super early, delicate little feelings that are so easy to miss.
That first time you feel your baby move has a special name. It's called quickening, and it usually happens for the first time somewhere between 16 and 22 weeks. Now, that's a pretty big window, right? And there are some really good reasons for that.
The crazy thing is, these first movements almost never feel like a big old kick. They're way more subtle. People describe them as fluttering, kind of like butterflies in your stomach, or even like tiny bubbles popping. My personal favorite descriptions? A tiny goldfish swimming around in there. Or, and this is the most common one, something you could easily mistake for just a bit of gas. And why the huge time range? Well, a couple of things are going on. If this is your first baby, you might feel things a little later, just because you don't really know what you're looking for yet. But moms who've been through it before, they often recognize that little goldfish feeling much sooner. And believe it or not, where your placenta is matters too. If you have an anterior placenta, meaning it's at the front of your belly, it acts like a built-in cushion, softening those early kicks and making them a lot harder to feel.
Of course, as your baby gets bigger, that conversation gets a whole lot louder. Those little gentle whispers, they start turning into much clearer statements as their kicks get stronger and way more obvious.
You can really see how it all evolves. You start with what we call the whispers, those flutters and bubbles we just talked about. Then, somewhere around 24 to 28 weeks, you move into statements. These are undeniable kicks, actual rolls, big stretches. And then by the third trimester, when things are getting pretty crowded in there, the movements change again. They become these big, sweeping stretches that you can sometimes even see from the outside, and you'll definitely feel a lot more pressure.
Okay, now here's a really unique type of movement you might feel: hiccups. It feels like these tiny, perfectly rhythmic little taps, over and over, that can go on for a minute or two. It feels a little weird, I'm not gonna lie, but it is such a great sign. It means your baby's brain and their diaphragm are practicing, getting in sync. It's totally normal and actually pretty cool.
So with all this chatter going on, how do you make sure you're really tuning in? Well, that's where kick counts come in. And I want you to think of this less like a medical chore and more like your special daily check-in, a time you set aside just to listen to your baby.
It's a really simple but incredibly powerful way to connect. So how do you actually do it? How do you carve out that time to really pay attention?
The whole process is super simple, really. First, you want to pick a time when your baby's usually having a bit of a party in there. You know, maybe after you've had a meal or right when you lie down for the night. Then, just get comfy. Lying on your left side is great for circulation, so that's often recommended. And then, you just start counting. Every distinct movement, a kick, a big roll, a little swish, that counts as one. You're just counting to 10.
And here's the general rule of thumb the doctors give. You're looking for about 10 movements within a 2-hour window. Now, honestly, most of the time, your baby will probably hit 10 movements in like 10 minutes. And that's fantastic. That 2-hour mark is really just the safety net.
But this is the most important thing to understand about kick counts. It's not really about hitting the magic number 10. The real goal here is for you to learn your baby's unique daily rhythm. Maybe they're a morning person. Maybe they're a night owl. The real power of doing this is that you establish their normal pattern, which makes you the first person to know if that pattern ever changes. And that brings us to the most critical part of this whole conversation: knowing how to recognize when your baby might be sending an urgent message, one that you need to act on right away. You need to call your doctor or midwife immediately. Don't wait. If you notice a big, sudden drop in how often they're moving, or if the movements suddenly feel a lot weaker, almost muffled, if you go for long stretches of hours without feeling anything at all, or really any major change from what you've come to know as their normal pattern.
And look, if you ever feel like you're bothering them or you're not sure if it's serious enough, please remember this quote from labor and delivery nurses. They would so much rather have you come in 100 times and have everything be perfectly fine than to miss that one single time when something is actually wrong. Your gut feeling is always, always valid.
Which really brings us to the main point here. After weeks and months of having this private conversation, nobody on this entire planet knows your baby's movements better than you do. You are the world's foremost expert on your baby.
And before we wrap up, we have to bust a very common and honestly a very dangerous myth. You have probably heard someone say that babies move less right before labor starts. That is absolutely not true. Now, the type of movement might change a little as they run out of room, more big, slow rolls and fewer sharp jabs, but the number of times they move, the frequency, should not go down.
So if you only take one single thing away from all of this, let it be this. You can never, ever be too careful when it comes to a change in movements. If you feel it, if your gut tells you something is different, trust that feeling. Always call, always go in. Learning this language of kicks and wiggles, it's just this profound connection. It is your very first conversation with your child. So my final question for you is, now that you know how to listen, what's the first thing you're going to say back?